Hey everybody, my name is Aaron Straney, and today in my PowerPoint presentation I'm going to talk to you guys a little bit about cardiovascular disease and diet. Specifically diet that combats cardiovascular disease. So what we're going to go over today, we're going to talk about cardiovascular disease, we're going to define the term, we're going to talk about the causes, the risks, and the stats, and then we're also going to talk about the diets, specifically the Nordic diet, Mediterranean diet, and the plant-based diet. And then what I'm hoping for you guys at the end of this presentation is that you'll be able to define and understand cardiovascular disease. You'll be able to recognize the risk factors for cardiovascular disease, utilize healthy diet alternatives, and make an impact in spreading diet knowledge. So let's break down the word cardiovascular disease. Cardio meaning heart, vascular meaning the vessels that pump the blood to and from the heart. Excuse me. And you know what I think with this disease, it's very important to know, I think, because it's a disease that affects the heart and the blood. So it's a very important aspect of our bodies that I think we need to understand. And unfortunately, cardiovascular disease affects and causes 1/3 of the deaths in the industrialized world. So I think it's very important for us to know this so we can combat this disease. Now, as you guys can see, we're going to start here. We're going to look at this diagram to better fully understand cardiovascular disease. This right here is a normal artery, so normal blood flow to and from the heart and vessels. And then we see down here, these two pictures here, you see that gunky buildup in the artery. So that constricts blood flow, and so it leads to things like blood clots, stroke, heart attack, and ultimately death. So it's important for us to understand, what causes this. So basically what happens in the arteries is when there's an inflammation or damage to the artery, the body's defense mechanisms and healing mechanisms, cells called lipoproteins and monocytes, go to this area in the artery and try to heal the artery. But the drawback of that is that it deposits this fatty tissue. It's called atheroma. So this atheroma builds up, and if the problem continues to occur, it'll get bigger and bigger, and as we see here, causes a blockage in the artery, which, as I said, is detrimental to the person, and eventually leads to critical conditions and eventually death. So, and the risk factors of cardiovascular disease. Cardiovascular disease is a lifestyle disease. So it's what we do and what we put in our bodies. And there's 7 major risk factors. First one is smoking status, whether or not we smoke, body mass index, physical activity, whether we do sedentary lifestyle or if we're physically active, dietary score, total cholesterol, blood pressure, and fasting glucose. Diagnostic imaging also has a vital role in determining whether a person has cardiovascular disease. What happens is we inject contrast through the vessels so we can highlight the heart and the vessels to see if we can distinguish coronary anomalies, venous obstruction, and a very interesting tool with diagnostic imaging is cine imaging. So what happens, we inject the contrast, and there's a loop of a live heartbeat, and the contrast goes through the vessels to see if there's any blocked vessels, so we can distinguish where those are and correct those difficulties there. And then just talking about the numbers with cardiovascular disease and how it relates to the risk factors with it. First, foremost, 78 million adults were considered obese in 2010. And given the fact that there's around 300 million people in the United States alone, that's almost 1/3 of the population obese. So this is affecting a lot of people. And then with our consumption, our diet, fat consumption has been shown to increase from 75 pounds to 85 pounds annually. So what we eat is not helping with fat. And then from a healthcare perspective, obesity alone will cost healthcare around $344 billion. So this is not only is it detrimental to the patients and the people, but it's putting a strain on the healthcare industry as well. Now, what's the best way to combat CVD? The best way is diet. According to Bergeron, diet is one of the best ways, again, to decrease the chance of CVD. We have to stick with a diet with lots of fatty acids, vitamins, minerals, and fiber. And we have to decrease our salt intake. Now, this is very important. Studies have been shown that correlate salt intake with blood pressure. So, when our salt intake goes up, our blood pressure goes up. And as you know, with the risk factors, blood pressure is one of the risk factors that increase our chances of CVD. So, Bergeron also explains to us that if we just decrease our salt intake by 1 gram a day, we can decrease our blood pressure by 1.6 mmHg, or millimeters per mercury. So we talked about salt. Now let's talk about sugar. We know sugar is big in our diet, and there's too much of it, frankly. And with too much sugar in the diet, this increases the postprandial response. Now, postprandial response is basically after we eat a big meal, it's the time afterwards. So if we eat a meal high in sugar and processed foods, this response goes up, and it ultimately spikes and leads to inflammation in the arteries and the vessels. And the blood glucose goes up. And then pop quiz for this one. So not only does the blood glucose goes up, but who remembers the cell that helps repair the damaged arteries? Monocytes and...
Starts with an L. I don't remember the name.
I don't know, AJ said lipocytes.
Yeah, lipoproteins. So, not only does our blood glucose go up, but our lipid levels go up. So, lipid equals fat. That's the fat proteins. So this goes up, and as we know, if that goes up, our lipid proteins go up, which causes more chance of clogged arteries, because the more lipoproteins, the more atheroma there is, which in turn creates more blocked arteries, eventually causing damage to the arteries. But one of the best ways to prevent this is to increase our fiber intake. So fiber lowers postprandial response, and it also lowers the spike in blood sugar. So this is a great way to decrease that response. Now I'm going to talk about the 3 main diets that have been shown to decrease cardiovascular disease. First, we'll talk about the Nordic diet. The word Nordic comes from the Scandinavian countries like Norway, Iceland, Sweden. So this is the diet that they use. And protein-wise, they use lots of fish like salmon and herring, lots of vegetables, root vegetables especially, so carrots, beets, turnips, onions, things of that nature. Lots of whole grains, so barley and rye, and fruits like blueberries and apples. And similarly, the Mediterranean diet is very similar to the Nordic diet, and originated in the Grecian islands like Greece and Italy. And they use the same thing, lots of fruits and vegetables, lots of substitute with oils, so less butter, more oils, natural oils to cook with. Lots of legumes like chickpeas as we see here, and lots of fish like octopus and fish from the sea. And a decrease in red meat, which is important, which I'll go over here shortly too. The only meat used really is fish and some poultry. And then we have the plant-based diet. Obviously, no animal-based products. So lots of fruits and vegetables, nuts, whole grains. And a study was done that showed that chronic disease increases when animal-based products are used. So as we can see in the next slide, people who stick with a vegetarian plant-based diet have a lower BMI, lower cholesterol, and lower blood pressure. So that's 3 out of the 7 risk factors for CVD right there decreased, just like that, just from this diet. And then crunching the data. cohort studies were done, specifically first with the Nordic diet. They were done, and it showed that people who followed the Nordic diet had a decrease in 6 out of the 7 CVD risk factors, which is amazing. And similarly, with the Mediterranean diet, a cohort study was done with patients who had heart attacks. Those who followed the Mediterranean diet had a decreased complications in their heart function compared to the people who didn't follow the Mediterranean diet. And then across the board with these studies, there was a reduction in all-cause mortality, diabetes, obesity, and cancer. So across the board, all of these ailments have been decreased just from simply changing the diet. In conclusion, I truly believe that diet is a plausible pathway for CVD reduction and prevention. And it has been said that half of cardiovascular deaths can be prevented simply by your diet. So that's the presentation. Thank you, guys.
It's awesome, Aaron.
Great
job.
Yeah.